May the peace and mercy of God be upon each and every one of you. It was a year before 9/11, and my wife and I were standing in the Wichita, Kansas airport waiting for our baggage to come down the conveyor belt. She was standing there with her hijab and her abaya, and of course I was standing there with my rather long, unruly beard. And a gentleman across the way, maybe 20 feet or 25 feet away, happened to glance over, see us, and then did a quick double take. And then he started to slowly meander around in a roundabout way, getting ever closer and closer to us, until after about 4 or 5 minutes he was standing right next to me. And at that point he turned to me and he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I'm from about 35 miles north of here." No, he said. "I mean, where are you from originally?" I said, "Well, I was born 30 miles north of here." Well, you could see the puzzled confusion cross his face, and he started to turn and walk away, and then you could see the light bulb going off above his head, and he turned back with sort of a triumphant look on his face, pointed at my wife and said, "Well, where's she from?" And I said, "Well, she was born 40 miles north of here." And at that, he just shook his head and walked away. I trust you see what was going on. He had correctly identified my wife and me as being Muslims. And having done that, he immediately wanted to rob us of our American identity and our American heritage. It was as though if you're a Muslim, you can't possibly be an American, especially not a natural-born American. Unfortunately, in America, there is an extremely prevalent myth that Muslims first arrived on the shores of America sometime in the latter half of the 20th century. This is a myth that's believed by almost all non-Muslim Americans, and unfortunately also believed by many Muslims who are Americans. The reality is, however, far, far different from that myth. The reality is that we Muslims have been in America all along. We Muslims were in America well before the latter half of the 20th century. We Muslims helped to tame and settle the American Wild West in the latter half of the 19th century during the era of cowboys and Indians. We Muslims fought to preserve the Union and the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. We Muslims stood armed and ready to defend the American coastline from British invasion in the War of 1812. We Muslims fought to secure American independence from Great Britain in the American Revolutionary War beginning in 1776. We Muslims built the agricultural base of the American South before there ever was a United States of America. We Muslims explored the Americas in the 16th century with the Spanish conquistadors. We Muslims were there with Columbus in 1492 when he supposedly discovered America. And yes, we Muslims were there long before Columbus was even born. Let me give you a few examples to substantiate each one of those propositions. To begin with, let's look at Muslims in America before Columbus. And at this point, I have to acknowledge Brother Abdullah Hakim Quick, who's sitting here in the first row, who is the person who's done much of the primary research in this area. So I am indebted, brother. Ancient Arabic sources indicate that there were at least 3 Muslim voyages from Muslim Andalusia to the New World. Abdul Hassan Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali al-Masudi, who lived from 871 to 957, writing in the meadows of gold and quarries of jewels, wrote about the voyage of Kashkash ibn Sa'id ibn Aswad in the year 889, over 6 centuries before Columbus. According to the account, Ibn Aswad sailed west with a Muslim crew from Delba, the same port from which Columbus would later sail some 6 centuries later. He found a new world and returned with wealth and booty from across the Atlantic. Approximately 1 century later, Abu Bakr ibn Umar al-Khatiyya reported that Ibn Farouk, in the year 999, sailed west across the Atlantic, landing in the Canary Islands in February of that year, and then continuing west until discovering 2 islands, presumably in the Caribbean, which he named Capraria and Pluitana. He returned to Spain in May of 999. And Al-Idrisi, the famous Muslim cartographer and advisor to the king of Sicily, wrote in his Excursions of the Longing Ones and Crossing Horizons about a group of 8 Muslim sailors who sailed west from what is today Lisbon, Portugal, sailing west across the Atlantic, and they sailed for 31 days before they landed on an unknown island and were captured and held prisoner by American Indians for 3 days. On the 4th day, stop and think about this now. On the 4th day, a translator arrived who spoke Arabic and arranged for their release. Obviously, there had been a great deal of sustained contact, quite possibly from Muslim West Africa at that point, for an American Indian to have become fluent enough in Arabic to be been able to serve as translator. Anyway, he arranged for their release, and they returned safely to Andalusia. But it wasn't just from Muslim Andalusia that the Muslims were in the New World long before Columbus. Sheikh Zain ad-Din Ali ibn Fadl al-Mazandarani sailed west from Tarfaya, Morocco in the year 1291 and landed on a green island, again presumably in the Caribbean, and returned safely to Morocco. But perhaps the most impressive of all the Muslim voyages to the New World, which we can today document, concerned the Mandinka of West Africa. Writing in the Pathways of Sights in the Provinces of Kingdoms, Shihab ad-Din al-Umari recounted a conversation that he had with the famed Mansa Musa, who was traveling through Egypt in his famous Hajj pilgrimage. And according to Mansa Musa, a few years before, his older brother, Abu Bakari, who was then the ruler of the Mandinka kingdom of Mali, had sent 2 expeditions west across the Atlantic, 2 fleets. This would be around the year 1310. Now, when Columbus sailed in 1492, he sailed with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. If we put the 2 Mandinka expeditions together, we have a combined total of 2,400 ships. A massive movement from the Mandinka of West Africa. And we know they reached America. We know that because of the linguistic evidence, if for no other reasons. There is today in South America an American Indian tribe that uses Mandinka ideograms as its form of written communication. And there is in North America an American Indian tribe located in the middle of the Atlantic seaboard, which back around the mid-18th century, a Moravian missionary went and studied with them and wrote a dictionary of their language. Modern linguists looking at that dictionary have discovered that many of those words are in fact Mande, the language of the Mandinka Indians. And at least one Central American Indian tribe has clan names that correspond exactly to clan names of the Mandinka of West Africa. Yes, we Muslims were in America long before Columbus, but we were also there with Columbus. When Columbus landed on San Salvador Island on October 12, 1492, he had with him at least one Muslim and 3 Moriscos. Now, the term Morisco may be new to many of you here in the audience, so let me digress for a moment. 1492, Granada had just fallen. The Spanish Inquisition was in full steam. Massive religious persecution was going on against both Muslims and Jews in what had been Muslim Andalusia. The Catholic Church was persecuting, torturing, and killing Muslims. The Muslims in what then was Spain, received a fatwa from North Africa that said you can go ahead and do a sham conversion to Christianity because you are in such danger. Just continue to practice your Islam in private. Those people, those Muslims who underwent this sham conversion and their descendants are known as Moriscos. So with that in mind, let's look at Columbus's voyage. The avowed Muslim that we know of was an African named Pedro Alonso Nino, and he helped navigate the Atlantic and map the islands of the Caribbean. The Moriscos were the 3 Pinzon brothers: Martin, who was captain of the Pinta, Vicente, who was captain of the Nina, and Francisco, who was a pilot of the Pinta. Columbus sailed with 3 ships. 2 of them were captained by Moriscos. In addition, one sailor, Rodrigo de Triana, also known as Rodrigo de Lepe, converted to Islam upon returning to Spain. Of note, he was the first person on Columbus's first voyage to sight land. We were there with Columbus, and we were there with the following Spanish conquistadors. Again, the Spanish Inquisition was going full steam in Spain, and Muslims, many Muslims, were looking for any way out from that country. One way out was to join the Spanish expeditions to the New World. And so Muslims were part and parcel of almost every one of the early Spanish explorations of the Americas. For example, we can point to Nuflo de Olana, who was an African Muslim who accompanied Vasco de Balboa in his expedition. But perhaps the most famous of all the Muslims to accompany the Spanish conquistadors was Estevanico of Azamor. Estevanico means Little Stephen in Spanish. And Estevanico of Azamor, you'll find his name in the history books fairly prominently. Spanish language movies have been made about Estevanico of Azamor. He's a very famous person. Of course, those history books and those movies typically fail to mention that he was a Muslim and that Estevanico was not his real name, it was his slave name. His real name was Mustafa Zamori. And Mustafa was a Muslim born around the year 1500 in Azamor, Morocco. By 1527, he was a slave to a Spaniard named Andres Dorantes. On July 17, 1527, Mustafa and his owner sailed from Spain to the New World. They reached the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean and joined the de Narvaez expedition of 5 ships and 500 to 600 men sailing to Florida. En route to Florida, this expedition was met with a hurricane. Some of the ships sank, losing all people on board. The surviving ships, upon landing in Florida, and the survivors disembarking from those ships, were immediately attacked by American Indians with a great loss of life. After that, Mustafa then led those who escaped the Indian attacks on a 5,000-mile westward journey on foot that took them through Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Mexico. The first person from the Old World to explore those states of the southeastern United States. By the time they reached Mexico City, Mustafa and only 3 others were still alive. But it wasn't just with the Spanish conquistadors. It was also with the early colonists. Consider the case of the Santa Elena colony. It was established in what is now South Carolina by Spain in 1566 and lasted for over 20 years. The early colonists, about 200 in number, were recruited from the Galician mountains in northern Spain and Portugal. This geographic area was heavily populated by Muslims and Moriscos, and it can be safely assumed that many of these Santa Elena colonists were in fact Muslims. It's also known that Spain settled Turkish Muslims who were silk and textile workers in Cuba, Mexico, Florida, and the American Southwest during the 16th centuries. But it wasn't just Spain. It was also Great Britain. During the 17th century, England settled Turkish Muslims, also silk workers, in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. The earliest written documentation of Turkish Muslims being in Jamestown is found in the year 1631. In fact, these Turkish Muslims became so numerous in Jamestown that the colony of Virginia passed a law prohibiting the importation of any more Turkish Muslims into the colony. We were there. We were there all along. And we also built the agricultural base of the American South. In one of the saddest chapters of American history, the agricultural base of the American South was built on the backs and the blood of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Of the approximately 20 million enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas, approximately 20 to 30% were Muslims. And many of these 4 to 6 million enslaved Muslims were highly educated. Many of them were scholars and imams, and at least one was a sharif, a direct lineal descendant of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. For years, small county museums in the American South had what they thought was sort of magical scribbling done by some African slaves centuries ago. In the last half century, scholars have started going into these small museums and looking at what's there. And what they have found is entire Qurans written in Arabic from memory by these slaves. Entire books of fiqh written from memory in Arabic by these slaves. Some historians are now estimating that the percentage of literacy amongst the slaves was actually higher than the percentage of literacy among the slave owners. It's just that the slaves' literacy was in Arabic and the slave owners was in English. In my book, Muslims in American History, I present 27 brief biographies of these enslaved Muslims in America. Let me share just a couple of them with you. The first concerns Yarrow Mahmoud. He was born in Africa around 1686 to 1707. Sources differ as to when he was actually born. He was enslaved and arrived in Maryland sometime around the year 1731, where he was purchased by the Bell family and put to work making bricks. Apparently, after building a brick home for the Bells did something that was most unusual in the American South. They freed Yarrow Mahmoud. This did not happen very often. But given his freedom, Yarrow Mahmoud continued to live in the area around what is today Washington, D.C. And accounts written about him at the time document that he was extremely well liked and admired by all who knew him. Those accounts also document the fact that he could be observed publicly walking down the streets and singing praises to Allah. And when the time came for prayer, no matter where he was, whether it was on the street corner or in the middle of the street even, he would immediately stop and perform his prayer. He lived to be over 100 years old and was still listed in the 1820 American Census. Perhaps more famous, though, was Kunta Kinte, immortalized in Alex Haley's book, Roots. Kunta Kinte was a member of the Mandinka tribe of West Africa. He was born around 1750 in Jafur, a village along the Gambia River in West Africa. He was educated in Quran and Arabic as a child in the local village school. At age 16, Kunta left the village to go out into the jungle to find some wood to make a drum. And at that point he was captured by slave traders, taken to the coast and transported to America on the Lord Ligonier. He arrived in Annapolis, Maryland on September 29, 1767. To give you an idea of the horrors of what is called the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas that the slaves had to endure. On Kunta Kinte's ship, 30% of the enslaved Africans died during that crossing of the Atlantic. 30%. Well, now that he's in America, Kunta Kinte was sold at auction to John Waller of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, and was given the slave name of Toby. Kunta, however, was a proud person, and he didn't take to slavery very easily, and he repeatedly attempted to escape, being caught each time. Finally, after his last attempt to escape, in order to keep him from running away again, his owner amputated his foot. He was then sold to Dr. William Waller on September 6, 1768. He later married and fathered one child, a daughter, Kizzy. We know that Kunta Kinte continued his prayers throughout slavery and that he taught the basics of Islam to his daughter. However, his daughter was then sold away to another slave owner and was raped by that new slave owner, giving birth to a son who's known as Chicken George. Photos of Chicken George, taken late in his life as an old man, show him wearing a thobe and a kufi. The Islam of Kunta Kinte, despite the horrors and hardships of slavery, had managed to survive to his grandson. We Muslims also fought to secure American independence from Great Britain in the American Revolutionary War. Consider the case of Yusuf bin Ali, also known as Joseph bin Ali, who was a Muslim from Arab stock in 18th century Africa. He was found wandering in the American wilderness by General Thomas Sumter shortly before the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. And when that war began, Yusuf was one of the very first to volunteer for General Sumter's brigade. Throughout the entire length of the Revolutionary War, Yusuf served as a scout for Sumter's brigade and later settled down in Sumter County, South Carolina. Yes, we Muslims fought to gain American independence in the first place. And a few years later, we stood armed and ready to defend the American coastline from British invasion in the War of 1812. Consider the case of Bilal Muhammad, a Muslim from the Fulbe tribe of Timbo in Guinea, West Africa. Muhammad was educated in Arabic and Quranic studies in West Africa and may well have been in training to become an imam. Around 1802, he landed in Georgia as an enslaved African, and he was purchased by Thomas Spaulding of Sapelo Island, Georgia. Now, Bilal must have been an extraordinary man. Within the hierarchy of slavery in the American South, there weren't very many steps. You know, the lowest rung on the totem pole was working out in the fields. This was hard, back-breaking work, and around 1800, the average life expectancy of a slave working in the fields was only 15 years. People were literally worked to death. Somewhat higher up in the slave hierarchy might be tending the master's garden, etc., and still a little higher up being a household servant. You had much better food, much better chance of continuing to live in these occupations. But this was usually it. But not for Bilali. Bilali was so exceptional that he actually became the overseer of the entire plantation. Usually this was someone who was a white, but here was an enslaved African who was the overseer of the entire plantation. And Spalding was so impressed with Bilali that we are told he did something quite unusual. He actually went to the trouble of going out and finding a copy of the Quran which he purchased and gave to Bilali. And he also allowed Bilali to build a small mosque on the plantation. Apparently the first mosque built in the United States of America, sometime in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. Well, when the War of 1812 broke out, the British threatened to invade Sapelo Island, Georgia, and they promised freedom to any slave who would rise up in rebellion against his owner. That's quite a carrot to hold out in front of someone. Well, Spalding and his family prepared to flee from the threatened British invasion, to leave the island. But before he fled, he called Bilali into him and asked him to organize the slaves to defend the island and Spalding's property. Bilali said that he could make no promises for Spalding's non-Muslim slaves, but he promised that every Muslim slave would fight to the death to preserve Spalding's property. So impressed was Spalding with Bilali that he actually went to the extent of arming Bilali and his fellow Muslim slaves with 80 muskets. To my knowledge, the only time in American history in which a slave owner dared to give guns to his slaves. This is how exceptional the character of Bilali Muhammad was. His word was his bond. Some decades later, we Muslims fought in the American Civil War to preserve the Union. Consider the case of Muhammad Ali ibn Said, who was born around the year 1833 in what is today Nigeria. He was educated as a child in Arabic, Quranic studies, and Turkish. At age 16, he was captured and enslaved, and then was repeatedly sold and resold many times, both in Africa and the Middle East. Eventually, he became the slave of a wealthy Russian. And with that Russian, he traveled throughout Russia, Persia, Georgia, Poland, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, France, and England. So quite a world tour. Finally, in England in the year 1859, the Russian emancipated Muhammad, gave him his freedom. And at that point, Muhammad traveled to the Americas as the paid servant of a Dutchman, and for the next 2 years, traveled throughout the Caribbean, Canada, and the eastern United States. In 1862, Muhammad crossed the border from Canada to Michigan and became a school teacher in Detroit, Michigan. 1 year later, in 1863, Muhammad enlisted in Company I of the 55th Regiment of the Massachusetts Colored Volunteers and fought in the Union Army in such battles as those at Fort Mims and Honey Hill in 1864, and at James Island and Biggin Creek, South Carolina in 1865. He must have been quite a soldier too, because he rose from the rank of private to sergeant in just his first 2 months in the Union Army. He left the military in 1865 at the close of the war, and his autobiography was actually published in Atlantic Monthly, at that point perhaps the most prestigious magazine in America, and that publication was in the year 1867. Muhammad died in Brownsville, Tennessee on August 6, 1882. We also helped tame and settle the American Wild West. Case in point, Haji Ali, who was born around the year 1828 in Syria, and at some point prior to 1856 completed the Hajj. In 1856, he entered the United States at Indianola, Texas, with a shipment of 33 camels. Now, let me digress for a moment. Jefferson Davis was then Secretary of War, and Jefferson Davis had this concept of introducing a camel cavalry into the American Southwest. This was his great experiment. Of course, Americans knew absolutely nothing about camels. They didn't know how to feed them, they didn't know how to care for them, they didn't know how to ride them. So the obvious solution is you brought in a camel expert. And that camel expert was Haji Ali. Now, if you look in the American history books, you probably won't find Haji Ali talked about, because Americans had just a terrible time getting their tongue around Haji Ali. And so they called him Hi Jolly. And you'll find Hi Jolly mentioned quite a bit in American history. Over the next 46 years after arriving in the United States, Haji Ali spent over 30 years working for the United States Army, variously as a camel tender, a wagon packer, a scout, etc. In addition, in his off time from the cavalry, he ran camel caravans in the American Southwest and mined for gold. He became a U.S. citizen in the year 1880, taking the name of Philip Tadro. Later that year, he married and eventually fathered 2 daughters. He died at Tyson Wells, Arizona on December 16, 1902. At the time of his death, he was one of the most beloved and colorful characters of the American Wild West. In fact, the state of Arizona erected a large monument over his grave, topping that monument with a large copper camel in remembrance of Haji Ali's service to the United States. In summary, we Muslims have a long and glorious history and heritage in America. We are not Johnny-come-lately to America. We've been there all along. We helped build America, and our heritage as Americans is firm for all Muslims. As to all that I have said, God knows best.
Well,
Thank you very much.
It turns out the British did not invade Sapelo Island, Georgia, so his judgment was pretty good in the long run. Had he refused the request and the British not invade, there may have been consequences. Yeah, this was an American convert. Some sources say he was the first American convert, but who knows? He was the son of a wealthy person from the East Coast, as I recall, but he sort of made his mark in journalism in the state of Missouri, and then had some diplomatic assignments in Southeast Asia, as I recall, and converted to Islam and started a, sort of an Islamic propagation society in America. This would be around the year 1880s.
Well, in terms of the slaves,
at the time, nobody was interested in writing their history. You have to consider the mental mindset that was going on in America at that time. For many, many Americans, the slaves were merely beasts of burden. It was an extremely cruel period in American history. So their history typically wasn't recorded at the time. Now, there were a couple of exceptions. Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was a slave in Mississippi whose history got recorded at the time, but it got recorded for very special reasons. Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was a prince from a West African kingdom. And the way the story goes, as a young man, he was a colonel in his father's cavalry. His father was the king. And a Scottish physician, who was the ship's physician on a British ship that had docked on the West African coast, decided to go for a walk. And he got lost and traveled way inland and was found half dead by the people of Ibrahim Abdul Rahman. And he was nursed back to health and stayed with that tribe for some time, and then announced his intention that he wanted to go back to England. And the king sent soldiers to accompany him to the coast and provided him with gold so that he could return to England. Some years later, Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was captured by slave traders and sent to the Americas, and was enslaved in the area around Natchez, Mississippi. And he was in slavery for years and years and years until he was an elderly man. He had managed to work his way up the slave hierarchy to the point where he was allowed to have his own little vegetable garden. And he would grow vegetables in this vegetable garden, and he was allowed on Sundays to go into Natchez, Mississippi, and sell his vegetables so that he could have just a little bit of money to his own name. This was unusual, but alhamdulillah, it happened for him. And as he's on the street there in Natchez, Mississippi with his cart of vegetables, he sees a white man riding a horse down the street. And you have to remember that Ibrahim Abdul Rahman had been a professional cavalry officer in his father's army. And from the way the person rode the horse, he recognized the Scottish physician that he hadn't seen in 40 years. Well, the Scottish physician dismounted, came over to look at the vegetables, and recognized Ibrahim Abdul Rahman and immediately embraced it. Now, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the early 19th century in Natchez, Mississippi. Here's a white man embracing an African slave publicly on the street. But not only did that, he immediately took Ibrahim Abdul Rahman by the arm and marched him to the governor's house and introduced him to the governor as being a sovereign prince from West Africa. Well, the story got around that this guy was a prince. And so a newspaper editor came and interviewed him and wrote some stories about him, and suggested that Ibrahim Abdul Rahman write a letter back to his family in West Africa, asking for their help in securing his freedom. And the newspaper editor promised he would take care of mailing it. And that did happen eventually. And because the United States at that time only had diplomatic relations with Morocco, the letter went to the royal family of Morocco. Fortunately, they knew Ibrahim Abdul Rahman's family. And so they immediately began pressuring the United States to release Ibrahim Abdul Rahman and send him back to West Africa. And eventually that happened. And then Ibrahim Abdul Rahman made a long journey from Mississippi to the eastern seaboard, in which he lectured to raise money to buy the freedom of his children and grandchildren that were still in slavery in Mississippi. And Ibrahim Abdul Rahman had undergone a public conversion to Christianity. And one of the things that he would do to raise money was to tell people that he was going to go back to Africa and be a missionary and convert the Muslims to Christianity. Well, at one stop in Philadelphia, a minister came up to him, Christian minister, and asked him to write the Lord's Prayer in his own language. And Ibrahim Abdul Rahman granted the request and wrote it. That piece of paper still exists. And it's a very interesting piece of paper because the writing is Arabic, and what was written wasn't exactly the Christian Lord's Prayer. It was Al-Fatiha. So, we have another case of an enslaved African who underwent a sham conversion of Christianity to basically to save his life. He eventually arrived back in Africa, but died shortly after that. So occasionally a slave was written up, but that didn't happen very often. As to the earlier stories, well, the West has a long track record of not mentioning that somebody's a Muslim. Ibn Sina becomes Avicenna in the West, etc. So this typically is minimized. Well, there was some heightened tension, I think, for Muslims in America immediately after 9/11. To a great extent, that tension has lessened in the last several years, so that there's not too much hassle anymore. I mean, you can sort of, if I go through, the airport security, typically I go through with no problems. They look at my beard and they think I'm a biker or something. But if I'm traveling with my wife, who wears the hijab and, abaya, you can bet we're going to be singled out for, individual search. But alhamdulillah, that's okay. I think if you look historically, name changes occurred when there was something offensive with the original name. Now, my name, Gerald, means spear thrower. Frederick refers to peace. So there's nothing in my name that would suggest, worship of something other than Allah. So I felt no need to change. I think for a lot of people this information is academic. However, for the second generation of Muslims in America, this information is a lot more than academic. Because the second generation of Muslims in America are undergoing a severe identity crisis. And that identity crisis is, how do I affirm my national cultural identity as an American and at the same time affirm my religious identity as a Muslim? And, these kids are being raised in America. It doesn't matter where their parents are from. The parents can be from Pakistan or Syria or wherever. The kids are being raised in America, and they're going to establish an American national cultural identity, regardless of how much their parents hate that. The problem that we face is that many of our immigrant brothers and sisters to America try to tie their home culture so tightly to Islam that when these kids end up rejecting the identity of being a Syrian or a Pakistani or what have you in favor of an American identity, they also end up rejecting Islam because the two have been tied together so tightly. This is why I wrote the book that I wrote in the first place, was because I wanted to give that second generation of Muslims in America, the youth of America, the knowledge that yes, we have been here all along. There's nothing contradictory about being an American and being a Muslim. And we have a heritage. Don't let anyone try to rob you of part of your identity because you're a Muslim. We've got the history behind us to show that it's our heritage as much as it is anyone else's. Okay, the Nation of Islam, you have to understand that the Islam of the African slaves, slavery was not kind and did not promote allowing people to pass on their Islam to their descendants. It was very difficult. I mean, slave work from sun up to sundown, 6 days a week, was fed very little, etc. In most states of the South, it was a capital offense to teach a slave how to read and write. So, even the enslaved Africans who were quite literate and fluent in Arabic, how do you teach your children very much of your Islam?
especially since your children might be sold away from you when they're quite young. So as a result of this, the pure Islam that these African slaves brought to the Americas over succeeding generations, it got diluted. By the early 1900s, the Islam was basically gone with a few isolated exceptions, the pure Islam. However, there were Islamic residuals that remained in the African American community. And two different groups, and probably more than two, but two come to mind, the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, built upon those Islamic residuals, but introduced into those Islamic residuals a racial mythology that was designed to increase the morale of African Americans who were being treated as a second-class citizen in America. And they were also combined sometimes with Christian elements, etc. Now, the Nation of Islam began around 1932, somewhere in there, with a person named Fard, and people disagree as to whether he was an Arab or whether he was a Pakistani, etc. So there's a lot of fogginess in knowing much about this individual. But he was a door-to-door peddler, apparently, in the African American community of Detroit, Michigan. And he started talking to the African Americans about Islam and their racial heritage back in Africa, etc. And out of this developed the Nation of Islam. And then Fard quickly left the scene, and the Nation of Islam was turned over to Elijah Muhammad, who claimed to be a prophet. And Fard was seen then as an incarnation of Allah. The Nation of Islam believed, well, for example, in their practices, they didn't fast during Ramadan. They fasted every December, and then Eid was on Christmas. And, so you could see that there were some Islamic residuals. People were told, yes, go out and buy a Quran, but you're not ready to read it yet. Put it up someplace high. Continue using your Bible. Now, this is sort of where things continued. And it built up into a large group in the African American community, maybe as many as 2 million people at its peak. In the early 1970s, Elijah Muhammad died, and his son, Warith Deen Muhammad, became the leader. And Warith Deen Muhammad had the advantages of having learned Arabic as a child, of having studied the Quran intensively, and of having been in contact with Muslims. And so Warith Deen Muhammad then led the Nation of Islam into Orthodox Islam. Probably over 1 million, maybe as many as 2 million African Americans made that journey with him. Years later, however, Louis Farrakhan tried to recreate the old Nation of Islam with some of its mythologies, etc. And that's still a group in America, but it's a relatively small group, probably not more than about 100,000 people at this point. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was one of those many African Americans who used the Nation of Islam as a stepping stone to get to Islam. Muhammad Ali would be another.